Okay, we'll go ahead and start moving towards beginning this evening. Got a few seconds to spare, but we'll just kind of move in that direction. What's that, Kurt?
You're still in Ruth.
Yes, Kurt, we are still in Ruth. Speaking of which, next couple things. Number one, next Wednesday we will begin in verse 14. So regardless of what we discuss tonight, we will start at verse 14 next week. So even if we only get through one verse tonight, so be it. And then secondly, plant a little seed here. In 2 Wednesdays, we're going to be out of town for a family vacation. So we have a choice. Since there's no other option to go to, we can either do a singing or something. But I thought if there's anybody here who wants to just do like a one-off, something that, Sherry? A one-off, just you've got something that's been rolling around in your brain. You're like, you know what? I don't know if I could do 13 weeks of that, but 40 minutes I can handle. So if anybody wants to fill in for 1 week in 2 Wednesdays, whatever you want to do, that come and talk to me about that. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So, of course, we are continuing in chapter 2, the Gospel according to Ruth. We're kind of one class behind, and then I forgot we were going to be gone that one class. So, we'll just kind of go through the pace that we need to go through. So, I want to begin. Well, actually, let me ask this: are there any follow-up comments or observations, anything that anyone would like to make from last week? I got a few emails and text messages, some interesting, good discussion, but nobody wants to bring them up here. Okay. All right, so we're going to begin with the very last verse of chapter 1, because you could almost make a point that this is really kind of begins chapter 2. But it says, "So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest." So let's begin by asking this question. Are there any incidental details in the biblical narrative? Incidental details, unimportant, trivial details. Chelsea says, maybe? Is that what that last phrase was? I say no. I say everything is there, every dot and tittle, to quote Jesus in a sense, okay, is important and relevant and is there for some purpose to say something. So when we're told at the very end that they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, I think that's something that we should kind of stop down and take note of. So let's talk about, just for a few minutes, about the barley harvest and how that might be relevant to what's going on in the remaining 3 chapters of the book of Ruth. So I want to start by putting this up here. Does anybody know what this is? It is a tablet, yes. This is called the Gezer tablet, or the Gezer calendar, and it was found in Tel Gezer, which is a little northwest of Jerusalem, one of the kind of the sentinel cities. If you either went to Israel with us or if you were in that class a year or two ago, you'll remember we talked about the Shvei Law, which was those north-south running 6 valleys that kind of separated the central hill country from the coastal plains. And they were kind of like saloon doors is the analogy that we used, where the Israelites and the Philistines would kind of go back and forth, for control of that area. And Gezer is in the Ayalon Valley, which is the the most top one, the north. I don't know how to say that grammatically. But the Ayalon Valley is in the north, and Tel Gezer, or Gezer, was the sentinel city that guarded that. And that's where this calendar was found. It dates back to the Iron Age. And the consensus among scholarship is that this is kind of a practice writing tablet for a young child, and his name is even there for us. Right here is his name, but we've put it over here as Avi, which of course is kind of a nickname for Abraham or Abraham. But just like today, we could all look at, the writing of a, 6, 7, 8-year-old who was kind of practicing and learning to write and know that's clearly not, that's not Bruce Petty's handwriting. He has the most majestic cursive if you've ever seen it. So, but what he's doing is he's practicing the agricultural calendar throughout the year. So 12 months in the year, if you add up the 2 months in month, you get 12 months there. But right in the middle of it, his month is for harvesting barley. So the barley harvest was really important in Israel's calendar. And it typically took place somewhere, for our calendar, roughly the second half of April. And of course, we think of Israel being on a religious calendar as well. And the first festival that was on that annual calendar for them was the Feast of Passover, which began on the 14th of Nisan. And then you have the Feast of Unleavened Fruits, which begins one day later, the 15th. But then on the 16th of Nisan, you have the Feast of the First Fruits. And so the barley harvest was kind of beginning their agricultural year and their religious year by recognizing that God was providing for them by bringing up out of the ground and bringing new life and growth and fertility, and that they had only God to thank for it. And so when we read through the book of Ruth, beginning in chapter 2, we find ourselves, after 10 years in Moab, we find ourselves back in Bethlehem in late April, probably, at the beginning of the barley festival. And the events of this book will last about a month, because when we get to the end of the book, now we have the harvesting of not the barley crop, but the wheat crop, which typically took place about a month later, towards the tail end of May. And when we think about the tail end of chapter 1, when Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem, I know we didn't really get to spend much time on it, but in your own reading or consideration, how do we feel generally that Naomi was received by the real housewives of Bethlehem when they showed back up? What's the vibe that we get from that?
They were glad to see her.
Okay, that's a view. Josh says gossip. Rebecca says curiosity. Yeah, I mean, specifically, what's that?
They were questioning it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element here, and we talk.
They were kind of glad to see her because they already knew and they knew of her and what had gone on, but they were still questioning, hey.
Well, I think there's an element too that, we were able to paint a pretty reasonable picture a few weeks ago that the circumstances for Elimelech leaving Bethlehem in the first place it was not a wise decision, was not a God-trusting decision. And I think we'll see a contrast to that in the person of Boaz here in a few minutes. And we see the fact that Elimelech dies, that Mahlon dies, that Chilion dies. And I think it's a reasonable conclusion to say that when they come back, all these women who are saying, "Oh my goodness, is this Naomi? Is this Naomi?" And all this chatter, it's almost, like, I can't believe you're back. It's been 10 years. Where's your husband? Where are your sons? Who's this person with you? I mean, if I was forced to just pick one, is there kind of a positive vibe or a negative vibe to her return? If I had to pick one, I'd pick it's probably more of a negative vibe to her return. And when we read through those trailing verses of chapter 1, number one, we're never given any indication that the women of Bethlehem do anything hospitable to Naomi. We don't see like, "Oh my goodness, you have no husband, you have no sons, we're in this patriarchal society, no one's going to take care of you." Well, we'll take care of you, we'll pick up the slack. We don't see that taking place. It doesn't mean that it didn't, but it does mean that the author, the divine author of the text, chose to withhold that if it did happen. And then what kind of questions and comments do the women of Bethlehem have for Ruth? What, Rebecca? Nothing. I mean, we're not given any indication that anyone even recognizes or acknowledges the existence of Ruth, which again, we'll see a big stark contrast with that as we get into chapter 2. And so in that vein, it appears that no one within Bethlehem is offering Ruth and Naomi any kind of assistance when they return after a decade or when Naomi returns. And in a sense, we're going to see that they're going to have to fend for themselves. And that's literally what we're going to see here in the second verse of the chapter. But the rest of the story, the rest of the book of Ruth depends on the presence of this devoted Moabite woman, this devoted foreigner, and on the fact that it is the time of the barley harvest, which gives this tiny little intimation, this little wink of possible hope for these women, that for barley, the first crop to ripen is a harbinger of the restoration of fertility, and that's not only going to be for the land, but also for Naomi and Ruth. So I think it's worthwhile theologically to consider of all the, the gin joints and all, whatever the line is. I've actually never seen Casablanca. But they're going to show up right at the time of the barley harvest that symbolizes new life, new birth, fertility, new growth. And that's going to wink a little bit about what we're going to see unfold in the lives of Ruth and by extension, Naomi. So that's where chapter 1 ends, and then we will come into chapter 2. We'll read it together and then we'll go through it. The first 7 verses. It says, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of Shibboleth,' or grain, 'after him in whose sight I shall find favor.' And she said to her, 'Go, my daughter.' So she set out and went and gleaned in the fields of the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, 'Yahweh be with you.' And they answered, 'Yahweh bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the Omarim after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest in the house." So let's talk about this first little section. The first thing I want to point out, if you take the very first verse, I probably should have put it on there, but from "now Naomi" all the way to "whose name was Boaz," that sentence, grammatically, that's kind of like a parenthetical aside. Okay, what that means grammatically is that what is being stated in that verse is for the benefit of the reader. So the narrator knows about this guy named Boaz. The reader knows about this guy named Boaz. But who does not know about this guy named Boaz? Yeah, Ruth and Naomi. This is a little aside, we're in a cool club that we get to know about the existence of this man before we continue reading. And as we go through that little parenthetical aside, I think we're supposed to get more and more excited the more we read. Wait a minute, it's a relative of her husband's? It's a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech? Oh, I can't wait to see how this is going to unfold. So when we are actually introduced to Boaz, we have some idea, we already know the direction that the story is going. And God does not create any catastrophe. We talked a few weeks ago about how it's a reasonable conclusion to look at everything that happened to Elimelech's family, that this was divinely instigated by God. But God does not create any catastrophe without also establishing its remedy. And now we're going to see the remedy to the catastrophe of chapter 1. So let's talk about a few important words that we see here. I want to start with kind of just a philosophical question. We'll open it up for discussion. But when it says, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's," in Hebrew, the single word translated relative is meodah. Okay, I'll say it again, meodah. And I'll repeat it one more time after I say this question. I'll repeat it slowly. But listen to this word and think, is there another Hebrew word that sounds awfully similar to this one? Me-yadah. This one you've all heard before. And Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived. And Adam yadah his wife Eve, and she conceived. Yadah is the Hebrew word for to know. Now, I read a dictionary entry on an aardvark, so I know all about an aardvark, but it's to know intimately, it's to know experientially. There's an extraordinary closeness there between these two people, as you can see with an Adam yadah his wife Eve. Now, sometimes one sub-bullet point, I guess we could call it, of the word yadah does have a sexual connotation to it. But the broad umbrella of the word does not have that. Remember, that's just a sub-point. It means that there is a very close, familial, intimate relationship. Oftentimes, God is said to yadah Israel. That's the kind of relationship he has with Israel. And it's the same word that's used here. There's just a prefix on it. may, but it's the same word. So the narrator has chosen to use a word that makes it very clear that this individual, who we now know as Boaz, has a very close, intimate, familial relationship with Elimelech. Okay, they're probably cousins. The example that goes right to my mind is Aaron has a cousin named Leah. Leah's mom and Aaron's mom are twin sisters. Aaron and Leah were born about 6 weeks apart, and they are cousins, but they are closer than most sisters that I see and interact with. They yada each other. They have a very close, intimate relationship, okay? And again, I know this is on a live feed. Do not misunderstand me. I'm not saying there's an improper relationship between Elimelech and Boaz. Don't construe that the wrong way. But these two guys are really close. At a minimum, we would say they were really, really close friends. So does does Boaz recognize when Elimelech leaves Bethlehem 10 years prior? Yeah, I mean, I would assume so. So here's my question. And I have an answer. I've chewed on it all week. I don't know if it's a great answer, but I have an answer. But I'd like to see what y'all thought. If Boaz has this kind of relationship with Elimelech, and Naomi comes back into town, and Elimelech ain't part of the picture anymore, and Mahlon's not part of the picture, and Kilion's not part of the picture, why do the events of the book, beginning with verse 2 of chapter 2, even have to occur in the first place? Why is Boaz not intentionally and purposefully going towards to Naomi to redeem her and bring her into his Beit Av, or his household? Rebecca?
Well, as she said to the women, she feels like the Lord has testified against her. She doesn't feel like she's worthy of anything that she should receive from her husband's family.
Yeah. And I agree with that. So to piggyback on that, is her self-unworthiness equivalent to Boaz viewing her that way? I mean, probably not. So while I agree with that, I don't think it takes Boaz off the hook, Phil.
Well, Boaz seems to be a very righteous man doing God's work right. Elimelech apparently was not, because he left the promised land, went someplace, he let his sons marry, women that God said not to do. So is Boaz maybe seeing that as, well, this is God's punishment, or seeing this is someone who's not a believer, faithful, so I don't want them in my household?
Possibly. Yeah, I don't have a definitive answer. So, Ellen?
We know there's a closer redeemer. So could there also just be Boaz's, he sees this need, but he's not going to overstep his position, even though he and Elimelech may have been friends at the time, until it's proven, okay, he's not doing it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't step in.
Anybody on this side? We'll do one more. Don?
I'm gonna go with this time. It says they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest. Maybe Boaz hadn't been informed of her arrival.
So we definitely know he has been, as we'll find out as we progress through the chapter. So here's my thoughts on it, okay? You don't have to go with me on this journey if you don't want. But one of the things that we said in our very first class is that all Scripture points to Jesus, okay? That if we're not seeing Jesus in the text, then we need to reread the text. And the passage that we kind of use as our jumping off point for that was Luke chapter 24 and the road to Emmaus, when the two guys are walking down the road, going home after leaving Jerusalem and seeing all the crazy stuff that happened there, and Jesus joins up with them, and eventually their eyes are open, and he says, the text says in Luke that he showed to them in all the Scriptures the reality of his existence. And we've talked before about how Boaz is the dominant Christological figure in the book. He's not the only Christological figure, as we saw with Ruth last week, but he's the dominant Christological figure. That when we read through the book and when we look at Boaz, we should be seeing Jesus. And one of the things that I take from this, as I kind of ruminated on it and marinated on it over the last few days, was I can just see Jesus pulling those two people aside and saying, hey, I'm going to show you in all the scriptures the things concerning me. And he takes him to the book of Ruth and he says, hey, you remember when we read about Boaz? That was me. You were reading about me. And here was this woman, Naomi, this Israelite, this Jew. And here was Ruth, this Moabite. What's the biblical word? This? Who said it? Gentile. And what we see in the text is Boaz, the Jesus figure, prioritizing and going to and redeeming the Gentile and bringing her under his wings, in a sense, as the text will tell us. And Naomi, by extension, gets to come along with that. And so in the fact that Ruth is the person that Boaz really seems to seek out and immediately bring into his home, we see that blending of Jew and Gentile. And I personally can't read the text without seeing that element of the gospel message in the way Boaz chooses to interact with Naomi and Ruth. So that's one conclusion that I draw. You don't have to go with me on that journey if you don't want, but that's kind of how I looked at it. But it goes on to say a worthy man, which in Hebrew is Ish Gibor Hayil. And that word hayil can have a number of different connotations with it. It's someone of worth, it's someone of valor, it's someone of stature, of competency, of wealth, and the word is even used with regards to fertility in a few places in the Old Testament. But remember, we have this Ish, or this man of worth and valor, but we also have Ruth is called an Isha hayil in the text as well. So they're going to be very well paired for each other. But I want to put a quote on the screen from Yael Ziegler, which I really liked what she had to say about that phrase. It says, this phrase, Ish Gibor Hayil, is especially noteworthy as the Hebrew Bible tends to eschew direct descriptions of the traits of characters. And that's true. Start reading through the Old Testament narrative and you don't usually find like very clear-cut adjectives used to describe people, okay? There's some exceptions, like Moses was the humblest man who ever lived, wrote it about himself. Preferring to allow their deeds and their words to speak for themselves. In this way, the Hebrew Bible allows for the characters to be represented in all of their depth and complexity, creating a vague backdrop that contains multiple possibilities for development. At the same time, it encourages the reader to become an active participant in the story, capable of drawing conclusions with regard to the character's nature. Perhaps most significantly, this reticence reflects a particular view of human nature implicit in the Hebrew Bible. People are free to create their destiny and are not doomed to one-dimensional representations that determine their essence. I just love the way that's phrased. And that's something that Sherry and I were emailing back and forth, last week, of when we have this tendency to put the biblical characters in these kind of idyllic ivory towers, rather than really wrestle and grapple with their humanity, which we should do if we truly view them as actual human beings, in real history and real place. And so I just love what she had to say about that text. Last thing we'll say about this verse here, of course, what does Boaz's name mean? In a book where names are really important, what does Boaz mean? Strength. It means strength. She is upgrading for the newer model of the iPhone because husband number one, Machlon, anybody remember what his name meant? Sickly, okay? So we are going from sickly to strength, okay? All right, we'll just pause there before we go on. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add into our discussion? Gene? No? Okay, all right. So again, let's just talk broadly. So Ruth the Moabite says to Naomi, I think it's really interesting that, it's obvious, but who takes the initiative here? Ruth. Ruth takes the initiative, and it's interesting. This is the first time that the two of them speak in the text ever since Ruth gives that great declaration of like, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. And remember, how many times did Naomi try to change the daughters-in-law's mind and send them away? 3 times. And finally, after Ruth gives her AT&T, her final rebuttal, where she says, you cannot turn me away, the text says essentially that Naomi just shut up. She gave up. It's a very firm declarative word in Hebrew that she gives up. She stops talking. So all the time that they continue their trip to Bethlehem, we don't get any narrative between them, any dialogue. When they get to Bethlehem, we don't get any dialogue between them. And the first time we see them speaking again in the text is when Ruth the Moabite is going to take the initiative and stand up and do what is right, what she feels is right for Naomi. Rebecca.
So I know that obviously God had laws for how they were to reap their harvest and everything.
Yeah, which we'll look at a slide in that in a second.
Was it common for other cultures to have similar
Yes.
practices?
Yes.
Okay, so Ruth kind of would have already known.
Yeah, in fact, if you want, I can bring you some journal articles next week. But yeah, the concept is understood. I think there was probably an expectation that exceeded the other ancient Near Eastern cultures within the Israelite culture, but I think she would have been aware of the paradigm. But she says, let me go. This is, sometimes we read this in English as if she's asking for permission. In fact, some Bibles put the word please in. They're like, please, let me go and do this thing. The word please is not there in the Hebrew. This is a statement of intent, a declarative statement of intent that is brought about by circumstances. Ruth realizes we are on the precipice, we are on the threshold, we are on the cusp of death. And one of us is going to have to do something about this to change our fates. Because as we look through the text, all Naomi says is, yeah, okay, go, my daughter. Naomi doesn't really seem to really be jumping at the shark here. I think of the phrase, fortune favors the bold. Naomi is not the bold. Ruth is the bold one who's going to look out and do what is right for herself and for her mother-in-law. So let's, as we said with Rebecca, let's look at a couple passages though that give us Old Testament context for the idea of gleaning through the fields. Deuteronomy chapter 24, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner or the foreigner, the fatherless and the widow, that Yahweh your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this. So, the part of the reason this is so important to God is because, you Israelites, you know what it's like to have to sleep in your car. You Israelites, you know what it's like to struggle to pay the bills, to be at the mercy of other people. You spent time in Egypt, and as a result, you of all people should show compassion to the less fortunate who come upon your land. The concept's repeated in Leviticus. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. Why? Because I am Yahweh, your God. So sometimes we talk about that idea of leaving the corners or leaving the edges of their fields in an ancient Israelite context for the poor, the widow, the sojourner who might be in need, which at some point kind of begs the question it doesn't tell you how big the corners are supposed to be. It doesn't tell you how big the edges are supposed to be. So it's like, am I going to be a really stingy, okay, I'll check the box, or are you going to be somebody who's like, man, I'm just letting this go crazy all over the edge of it. But that's the background for what Ruth is trying to do here.
I would imagine the people that had the fields developed a reputation and the gleaners knew which fields to go to.
Yeah, that totally may be the case. Like, for example, if I really need money, I'm not going to Logan. I just know that's not going to. It was a joke. Logan's a very generous guy. He's a very generous guy. So I do want to point out that she says that she wants among the ears of the Shibboleth. And the reason I've pointed, Leon Cass has a quote here. This is a great quote, another great quote. He says, the practice of gleaning is rooted in the Lord's commandments at Sinai. Several times in the Torah, the children of Israel are ordered not to harvest their entire fields or to gather any leavings from the ground. The corners of the field and all fallen crops are to be left for gleaning or gathering up, lakat. by strangers and the poor, and in one version of the injunction, also by widows and orphans. This gracious practice of charity towards those lacking their own land to plant and harvest embodies and mirrors a deeper teaching about the land and ownership. Just as the promised land is a gracious gift from the Lord to the children of Israel, so what the land produces is a gift to its inhabitants. To be sure, people must till the soil if it is to bring forth its plentiful fruit. But the fertility of the earth precedes human labor and exceeds human merit. Indeed, the land produces generously. It yields more than enough to meet everyone's needs. There is therefore no reason to hoard against tomorrow or to take more than is required to feed your family or livestock. And the abundance also allows you to feed your neighbor and to nourish the larger community. Ownership of land, which ultimately belongs to God, is thus for stewardship rather than for self-appropriation and exploitation. Leaving the gleanings of your fields for the stranger and the poor mirrors the grace of the land itself. Okay, so going back to some slides here. Fields were demarcated in ancient Israel by stones. Of course, you got stones and rocks all over the place out there. But you can see, in the foreground and then further out here, how they kind of mark off their fields. Here's more of a close-up picture of them. These are from David Bivens' collection from about 1970, before there's skyscrapers in the background. And then I love these photos. These are photos of from 1970, but from actual women, gleaning through the barley and wheat in the fields just outside of Bethlehem. So just kind of gives us something to put in our mind's eye about what this might have looked like. And of course, Boaz's field, there's a souvenir shop there in Bethlehem. Some of us, I think, saw that. So anyway, okay, so now going back to the text, I did want to point out that in the text it says that she wants to glean ears of shibboleth. And what that is, that's what you're supposed to do. That's the guys are going around taking the barley, taking the wheat, tying it up into these big sheaves, that we're carrying around. They're bound down to Joseph and stuff. And then you kind of stay at a healthy distance, and then you're just picking up whatever falls off. That's what Ruth says that she wants to do. And I only point that out because when we get a little later, a few verses down, we'll see that she's accused of doing something else. But she says, I'm going to go do this, and I'm just going to try to find favor in somebody's eyes. She's not asking for permission. There's an element where she's doing this anonymously, just kind of hopeful that, as maybe to Kurt's point, maybe as she's going from field to field. I don't know if Boaz's field is field number 1, but as she goes from field to field, hoping that somebody will show kindness and generosity and allow her to do this. So back to Rebecca's point and the slides of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, while this is the expectation culturally and for God's people, how well do we think Israel actually did at these gleaning laws in practice, in reality? Yeah, I think Carol's right. Go ahead, Phil.
So probably about as good as worshiping God consistently.
Yeah, Boaz clearly did his part. But by and large, remember, we're in the days when the judges judge and everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. And it appears that Ruth doesn't have any real expectation that she's just going to be allowed carte blanche onto any field that she wants, that she's just going to kind of go field to field until she finds favor in somebody's eyes, until somebody looks down on her and says, yes, I am perfectly fine with you doing this. And that's what we're going to see her do. Now, here's my question. Why doesn't Naomi participate? Okay, she's tired. She's suffering from some depression. She's hiding. I love that answer. She's hiding from the housewives. Putting ourselves in Naomi. Which one's which? Naomi. Putting ourselves in Naomi's shoes. And this is some of what Sherry and I were talking about. How would we feel if we came back homeless, familyless, penniless? What would our general attitude be walking in with our proverbial tail between our legs? Embarrassed? Yeah, do I finally have agreement from Sherry on something? Every time I look at Sherry, 9 out of 10 times when I look at Sherry, she's going. She keeps me honest. Hey, my prayer before I teach a class is that I think slow, because I know my brain works too fast. So,
She's so embarrassed, she doesn't even want anybody to say her name. She's asking for people, just not to recognize her at all.
I see in this an element of, what does she view her long-term prospects for success? What do we think? 0 says AG.
I don't think she cares.
So then what's her concern for short-term success? Survival at best? Could we say that? Jim?
So when she left,
Well, hold on, let's let Jim go.
Question, just from some of the references I'm reading. So, certain relatives she would have known that there's this responsibility of kinsman redeemer.
Talking about Naomi?
Yeah, not Ruth. I don't think Ruth, maybe Ruth, wouldn't have known this until she was informed, but Naomi knew about this responsibility of kinsman redeemer. Boaz knew, and even, I think that might be why he initially backed off, because there's a protocol, there's another relative who's closer. But is the responsibility of the kinsman redeemer, wouldn't that have applied to Naomi as well, that she would have,
Well, I mean, by definition, the Goel is if you want to get technical, it's literally a flesh and blood immediate family member, which that's part of what makes Boaz's efforts in the book so extraordinary, because he actually doesn't technically have the legal obligation of a levirate marriage, or yedum in Hebrew. There's another guy who has that responsibility, and he doesn't, we'll get there, but the other guy, and what's really cool is in a book where names are so important, he doesn't get one because he shirks his responsibility. He's more concerned about the possessions than he is the person. And as soon as he finds out he has to bring the person into tow, he says, I'm out. Whereas Boaz is more interested in the person than the possessions. So Boaz is going to go above and beyond what's technically actually expected of him. But nonetheless, he is a kinsman. He's from the same clan of Elimelech. There is a closeness and a tight-knitness there that, going back to our very first question of the class, is like, couldn't he have solved Naomi's problems as soon as she gets back into town? And it becomes very evident as we read through the rest of chapter 2. In fact, on the next slide, in verse, I forget the verse, but it's in the next section, he basically says, obviously I know about you. Everybody knows about you. I mean, that's the force in the same Hebrew word is used back to back to emphasize everybody is aware of you, Naomi, that you're back and everything that's happened to you. So, but nobody's flocking to her. And I think that's part of the question. Why not? And regardless of the reason, it's the reality. And so I see her not really engaging this, that Ruth has to take the initiative because Mama is just content to curse God and die, to quote Job's wife. Because that reflects her general demeanor up to this point, more so anyway. Great. Verse 14 next week. So she happens to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, and behold, Boaz comes from Bethlehem. So in the last couple of minutes we have, let's just kind of discuss this. Why is Boaz come into the field? What?
He's a good boss.
He's the boss. Good boss. What? Managerial. I mean, we would assume he's coming to check on the harvest, the production. Phil?
They're day laborers, so he has to pay too.
Yeah, he very well may well have to pay them. Now, what's interesting is that he comes, we would assume, to check on the harvest, to check on the production. Hey, I'm the CEO. How is this going? But yet, the first word out of his mouth, in biblical narrative, there's whole volumes of books written on this. The first words out of people's mouths matter in biblical narrative. They are giving you a clue, just like their name often does, right out of the bat. Everything you need to know about this person, you're going to know from the first thing that comes out of their mouth. The first word out of his mouth is Yahweh. This is a man who is emphatically focused on the Lord. He is sticking out like a sore thumb in the period when the judges judged. And what we're going to see is as he immediately looks out, and he knows his flock so well, I'll phrase it like that he immediately recognizes when something is out of the ordinary, or when someone is out of the ordinary. That he looks right at his overseer and he says, whose is she? He didn't say, who is she? He says, whose is she? To whom does she belong? Because the fact that we have a woman, very well possibly dressed in all black, which would be culturally common when you've lost a husband, not just like the next week, but for like the next decade. Does this woman not have a Beit Av to call her own? Does she not have a home to go to for provision and protection and security? That's the first thing he acknowledges. So even though he didn't come to see Ruth, he shows that he's more interested in generosity than he is in industry. That he turns on a dime the second when he sees there's somebody there who is in need. And there's a really strong argument, I'll end with this, there's a really strong argument to be made that when he says, Yahweh be with you, remember, there's no punctuation in the Hebrew. It's likely that that's actually a question. Yahweh, is he with you? And so what he's really asking the people working in the fields is, are you adhering to Torah? Are you adhering to what's expected of you? Are you allowing people to glean in the land? And what's crazy about this, their response to him is, Yahweh bless you. But if we go back to the passage in Deuteronomy, it specifically says, where is it? So that Yahweh may bless you. And so when they respond, I'll finish here, and say, Yahweh bless you, what they're really doing is saying, yes, we are adhering to the expectation that you have for us. And so, again, it kind of paints this picture of Boaz that he's not so much industrious as he is religious. That in all aspects of his life, he is concerned with proper relationship to God. In other words, is he an Ish Gibor Hayil? Is he a worthy man? Absolutely. And that's who Ruth is going to fall into the arms of. And we'll see verse 14 next week.
Good evening. It's good to see each of you here. It's time for us to continue with our services tonight. And I do have a few announcements to make here to bring you up to date on a few people that are asking for prayers. And I'll start with June Seaton. As you know, she's still at Arlington Memorial in ICU. And we know that she had suffered a stroke, but she is doing better. In fact, they were planning on moving her to rehab, but they've had some problem with the rehab place she was in Arlington that she was going to be sent to because they cannot monitor the heart medication that she's getting. They are not able to put her there. And so now they are being recommended to go to it's Baylor Dallas Rehab, and that's where they're looking to put her, which is going to be quite a ride for the folks wanting to visit her and for her family. So they're asking prayers about that. If somebody is aware of some other place that might be able, a rehab place that she could go to, they would certainly like to be made aware of that. Sharon and I also like to thank you for the prayers for her dad, Ken Wynn. He is out of the hospital. In fact, he's at our house, and he is doing much better, and we hope they can get him on a plan that will keep him from relapsing back into the situation that he's been having to deal with. Sarah Burrell is still at home having problems with circulation, and from what I understand, Carol tells me this manifests itself in the fact that she just has very low energy and is tired out. So please keep Sarah in your prayers as well. And remember, Ken Savory will undergo surgery this Friday to address his ankle problems. And let's not forget our meeting here this Friday, 7 p.m. is the start of our gospel meeting. So let's make sure that we have made our plans and that we will be here for that meeting. Also want to remind you, if you didn't see it, Rustin sent out an email, a survey, if you will. He had some questions about for kids' classes and books. If that pertains to you, please answer Rustin, and if you did not see that email, let him know, and he'd be glad to resend it to you. So that's all I have tonight, and I will turn the services over to Thomas.
We're gonna old school it tonight. I don't have any slides, so let's turn to number 596. His grace reaches me. Sing both verses of this song. Deeper than the ocean and wider than the sea is the grace of the Savior for sinners like me. Sent from the Father, and it thrills my soul just to feel and to know the sun, it was greatest of treasures, and it's mine today. Though my sins were as scarlet, He has washed them away. And will last through eternity. Now I'm under His control, and I'm happy in my soul. Just to know that His grace reaches me. Song of Invitation will be number 311. Why not now?
Just before the end of the school year for the Christmas break, I guess, we had a faculty party and just hanging out with one of my good friends at Alley Cats. Just, you never know when a biblical conversation is going to pop up. And we were talking about his background and how he had a very rough growing up. And he started searching the scriptures and came to a realization of his desire to know the Lord because of a relationship that God desires for him. And it was an amazing talk. I told him I would give him credit. And so he made some interesting points. And one of those points, it started with that conversation in the garden where, which I think we all kind of understand that relationship there, where God created the world. He created the plants. He created even the animals. And yet he found no creation, no part of that creation was there anything worthy of a relationship. And so he goes to the Godhead and he talks and he speaks to them, let us make man in our image. We are that creation that he made for the sole purpose of a relationship. And if you remember, God walked with his creation. God came down and spent time with man, and in particular Adam. And one of the points that my friend made was that, isn't it interesting that while Satan was successful in tempting Eve, when it was just Adam and God, when it was just that relationship, that bond was so strong that Satan had zero success. We don't read of any success that Satan had with Adam. And that relationship, it took where Adam started to cleave to his wife, if you will. And I'm not saying that Eve was entirely bad, but that relationship directly with God was somewhat weakened because there was another person there to take Adam's attention. And that's when that relationship suffered. Fast forward on to Adam or to Abraham. God looked for a relationship still among mankind. And he goes down to the Ur of the Chaldees, where you have paganism everywhere. You have idolatry. You have people rejecting God. And yet there's this man named Abram who God draws out of that land, sends to a completely foreign country, and blesses him to be a father of a seemingly infinite group of descendants. But what's interesting, and this is the second, I thought, extremely interesting point, that God so much desired a relationship with man, that when you look at Sodom and Gomorrah, and I had never made this connection, but I thought it was fantastic. God, a righteous judge, with never making a mistake and never having any fault, when he looked to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he cared so much about the relationship that he had with Abraham that he doesn't just immediately go up and destroy, and he would have very much been justified. What he does instead, he says, let's go talk to Abraham about it. He cared about that relationship so much that he consulted with an inferior being, with a being that was guilty of his own sin, had his own problems, whatever. But instead of just wiping out Sodom and Gomorrah, which he would eventually do, he still goes to Abraham and cherishes that relationship. And it only, I think, if you look at the narrative, I think that only strengthens Abraham's relationship with God. So just because of his love for that man. But it's a direct conversation. If you look in Genesis chapter 18, you read that narrative, but in verse 22, it actually says, then the men turned away from there, went towards Sodom, while Abraham, so the judges were going to go and get Lot and all those guys. Okay, then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, while Abraham was still standing before the Lord. Abraham's not standing before an angel. Abraham is there with the Lord. Abraham came near and said, so Abraham is having a conversation with the creator of the universe because the universe desires to have that relationship with Abraham. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? And Abraham begins to reason with God. And the point is not necessarily the outcome. We know the outcome. But the point is that God has patience and love for Abraham enough to where he goes out there and he fosters, he cultivates, and he builds this relationship that he's always desired with man, that man has oftentimes rejected, but yet God still wants it. And I want to take you through Old Testament and New Testament to see that relationship. Because if you go anywhere, teachers, you go in the business world or whatever. In fact, I even remember when I interviewed for the job at the current school that I'm at, that the number one thing that my principal asked me about was, what's the most important thing? And his answer, which was my answer, I think that's one reason why we got along so good, was the relationship. I could teach you anything, but if there's no relationship, there's no connection, there's no growth. But this relationship God has always sought and always will seek with mankind. So I'm gonna speed read through some of these verses, but just to show you that God is consistent with desiring that relationship. In Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, it says, now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the people, for all the earth is mine. Everything's mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God will exalt us. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 33 says, for this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law with them and write it on their heart, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. In the New Testament, you have Jesus saying the same thing. So you have God the Father talking about in the Old Testament, Jesus saying the same thing in John chapter 15, verse 15. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends, because all things that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. Jesus desires that friendship, that close relationship, that beyond more than just an acquaintance, just a casual knowledge of who it is. John 3:16, we know this. How important is that relationship? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. For anybody, for everyone that will love him and obey him, Jesus died for us. That is not if you look at it, just on the broad sense, we know that sacrifice was never made for animals, never made for plants. It was exclusively for his creation of man. The Holy Spirit also, I think, is a part of this. So when you see these verses, it's the Godhead three. It's all three persons of God want this relationship. In Romans chapter 8, 15 and 16, for you have not received a spirit of slavery, leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption. God it's not just friends, God is adopting us as family. as sons and daughters, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. The Spirit is involved in this relationship. Revelation chapter 21, verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among the people, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. God has always desired a relationship, and God is wanting that relationship to be there again. But here's the thing. If you don't have a relationship, because we know that relationship will be rejected by mankind, God is seeking us, but we also have to seek him. Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is comfortable and my burden is light. Jesus is saying, come to me and let me take your burdens from you. John 14, verse 23, Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will follow my word, and my Father will love him. And we will come to him and make our dwelling with him. It's for those that love him and obey him. God is making that call. And I want to leave you with this, because I think this is extremely important. We are created in God's image. We are created with the same, need for a relationship. And if we're spiritually minded, we should be craving a spiritual relationship. So I would say to anybody here, if you're watching online, it's the same thing. As God's representatives, I'm going to leave you with what Paul said, because we all have that same desire. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 18 through 20, Paul talks about being an ambassador for God. We as Christians go out there and we seek those that are lost. That's our job. Jesus has done his part. Jesus is now sitting at the right hand of God, currently reigning. We have a job to go out there and seek those who are also lost. But it's not just, I'm going to go find you because that's my job to do. Notice how Paul expresses it in the end of that section. It says, now all these things are from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Namely, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting their wrongdoings against them, and he has committed to us the word of reconciliation. God has said, hey, Jesus sought to reconcile people. But now notice what Paul says. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. We beg you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. As a Christian now, I'm saying the same thing that Paul said, nothing new. We are begging you, if you're listening and you have no relationship with God, we are begging you, please make that right. If you're online, wherever you're at, this is something we love you so much that we want you to get right with God, because we also crave that spiritual relationship. This is not just we come to church because it's a checkbox thing. You should be longing for being with the brethren. The church is such an amazing design in his wisdom, the function of the church. It has its purpose, whatever. But as Paul said, we are begging you. And that includes those that are not in the church with us right now. We should not look down on other people. We should be begging them to love the Lord so much that they can have a relationship with God so we can have a relationship with them. It's such an amazing thing that God has presented for us. So as we come to the conclusion tonight, make yourself right with God. Get your life reconciled with God. If you're not a Christian yet, we are begging you as much as anybody out there in the world, make yourself right with God by putting the Lord on in baptism. That's the only way. You cannot come to God the Father without going through Christ the Son. Whatever you need to do, make your relationship right with God. Come now as we stand and sing.
While we pray and while we plead, while you see your soul's deep need, while your Father calls calls you home, will you not, dear sinner, come? Why not now? Far away, do not risk another day. Do not turn from God your face, but today accept His grace. Why not come to Christ, confession made. Come to Christ and pardon take. Trust in Him from day to day. He will keep you all the way. This time we'll be led in our closing prayer.
Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful day you have given us. Thank you for the weather. Thank you for the sun shining all upon us. And we ask for your prayers for all the sick people. We ask for continuing prayers for Olivia and Miss Sarah. And we ask for prayers for all the pregnant ladies, and that they all have safe deliveries and babies healthy. And please bless the gospel meeting we be having Friday, and that we all learn something and take something home from your word. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.